The morning I watched my granddaughter receive her college diploma, I sat in a parked rental car 3 blocks from the auditorium with binoculars across my lap and a heartbeat that did not belong to a woman my age. She was 22 years old that day. I had not spoken her name aloud to another person in 15 years, not because I did not remember it. I remembered it every minute, but because saying it out loud would have undone something I had spent every breath protecting. Most mornings now, I sit at a small kitchen table with my coffee and a window that looks out over a row of fir trees, and I think about all the rooms I have stood in without anyone knowing I was there. My name is Helena Marsh. I am 71 years old, and I have learned that the cruelest betrayals in this life almost always come wrapped in family, and that sometimes the only way to keep loving someone is to let them believe you are gone. By the end of this story, you will understand exactly what 22 years of silence can build when a woman decides not to break. My house sits on a narrow lot outside Astoria, Oregon, half a mile from the river and far enough from the road that no one passes by accident. It is small and modest, 2 bedrooms and a covered porch, and from the outside you would never guess what I have done with the last 2 decades of my life. I prefer it that way. I always have. The hallway between my kitchen and the small back bedroom has a wall I do not allow visitors to see. There are no visitors anyway. It is covered, top to bottom, with photographs. Some are clipped from school newsletters I subscribe to under a false name. Some are printed from social media accounts I have followed quietly with an email address that has never belonged to Helena Marsh. There is a picture of my granddaughter Wren at age 9, holding a science fair ribbon with both hands like she had personally invented the periodic table. There is one of her at 13, on a stage with a violin tucked under her chin. There are her high school yearbook photos, her college acceptance announcement, her hands in mittens at a snowy bus stop the winter she was 16. In every photograph, she has the same eyes she had at 7 years old when she stood in a black dress beside an empty casket and was told her grandmother had died broke and alone. That casket held no body. There had been no body because I was not dead. I had simply made the hardest decision of my life and walked out of one before my son could finish what he had started. His name is Bennett. He is 49 now. The last time I saw him in person, he was 27, standing in my kitchen telling me what he believed he was owed and what he believed I had stolen from him by refusing to give it. I had built a small business by then, nothing impressive yet but enough to keep me steady. He had a plan for that business. He had a plan for the house. He had a wife who had begun to look at my belongings the way a person looks at a buffet they have already decided to fill their plate from. I had said no. And in saying no, I had become, in Bennett's telling, a problem that needed to be solved. I did not understand yet how thoroughly he intended to solve me, but I would learn soon enough that some sons do not stop at theft. Some sons reach for the eraser. Before Bennett became the man who would bury an empty casket, he was a boy who used to fall asleep on the floor of my workshop while I sanded furniture by hand. I refinished pieces for a living back then in a 1-car garage on the south side of Eugene. Dining tables and dressers mostly. The kind of work that does not pay much but pays steadily if you are willing to put 12 hours into a chair that someone else will buy for $200 and feel they got a deal. His father had left us when Bennett was 6. There was no dramatic story to it, no betrayal worth retelling. He simply decided that fatherhood was not a project he wanted to finish, and he moved to Reno, and that was the last either of us heard from him for any meaningful length of time. I did not remarry. I did not date. I worked and I raised Bennett, and for a long time that arrangement seemed sufficient to both of us. Wren was born when Bennett was 26. Sloan, his wife, had wanted the wedding before the baby came, and they had managed it by 3 months. I drove down to Portland for the birth and stood in a hospital corridor at 2 in the morning and held my granddaughter when she was less than an hour old. She had a full head of dark hair and a frown that suggested she had already formed opinions about the lighting in the room. I fell in love with her in the way grandmothers do, which is to say, completely and without any reservation about what it would cost me. For the first 4 years of her life, I drove to Portland twice a month. I kept a duffel bag packed by the door. Sloan was polite to me in the way that certain women are polite to mothers-in-law they have decided to tolerate. She watched me with Wren the way a person watches a stranger handle something fragile, and I made my peace with it because the alternative was to lose access to a child I had no intention of losing. By then, my small refinishing business had grown into something I had not expected. I had begun acquiring estate pieces, restoring them, and reselling them to dealers in Portland and Seattle. A few of them turned out to be more valuable than anyone had realized when I bought them. I had a quiet eye for it, I suppose, Or maybe it was just patience. By the time Ren turned 5, I had paid off my house, set aside enough for retirement, and started a savings account in her name that no one knew about, because I had learned even then to keep certain things from Bennett and Sloan. The trouble started, as it usually does, with a request that was framed as an offer. Bennett came up to Eugene one weekend without Ren and without Sloan. He sat at my kitchen table and told me that he and Sloan had identified a property in Lake Oswego that would be perfect for them, and that the down payment was just slightly out of reach, and that if I were to refinance the workshop and put my savings toward their mortgage, I would be a co-owner in everything but name. He used the phrase generational wealth more than once. He said the words family legacy as if they were a brochure he had memorized. I told him no. I said it kindly. I said it the way a mother says no to a son she still loves but no longer fully trusts. I told him I would help in smaller ways. I would not mortgage my livelihood for a house I would never live in. He left that afternoon without finishing his coffee. I should have understood even then that his silence on the drive home was the beginning of something I would not be able to undo. The phone calls did not stop right away. That is the part people get wrong when they imagine how families come apart. It is rarely a single door slamming. It is 100 small adjustments over a year, each one reasonable enough on its own, until you look up one morning and realize the shape of your life has been quietly rearranged around you. In the 6 months after that kitchen conversation, my visits to Portland became more difficult to schedule. Sloan had a new work commitment on the weekends I usually came down. Ren had a swimming class that could not be missed. Bennett began returning my calls a day later than he used to, and then 2 days, and then sometimes not at all until I called a second time. None of it was hostile. That was the point. Hostile would have been something I could have named. I drove down anyway in early November unannounced because I had a birthday gift for Ren and I was not willing to ship it. Sloan answered the door in a cardigan and told me Ren was at a friend's house and that it was not really a good time. She accepted the gift on the porch. She did not invite me inside. I drove the 4 hours back to Eugene with the gift sitting on the passenger seat where I had not had a chance to give it to my granddaughter myself. That was the first weekend I sat in my kitchen and understood that I was being managed. In January, my accountant called me with a question I did not expect. She had been preparing my year-end documents and noticed that someone had submitted a change of address request for my business mail. The request had been processed 2 weeks earlier. The new address was a P.O. box in Beaverton I had never seen before. I had not requested any such change. My accountant had only caught it because she happened to cross-reference a missing invoice. I drove to the post office that afternoon and spent an hour with a clerk who was professional and apologetic and unable to tell me much. The request had been submitted online with what appeared to be valid identification. The signature on file was close enough to mine that no one had flagged it. I filed paperwork to reverse the change. I drove home and sat in my workshop for a long time with the lights off. I called a lawyer in Eugene the next morning. Not because I had decided what to do, but because I had decided I needed someone outside my family to know what was happening. His name was Howard Pratt. He was 60 years old and had been recommended by an old friend from my refinishing days. I told him about the address change. I told him about the visit Bennett had made about the down payment. I told him about Sloan on the porch with the cardigan and the birthday gift. Howard listened without interrupting. When I was finished, he asked me one question. He asked whether my will and my financial documents were stored anywhere my son had access to. I sat with that question for a long moment. The answer was that Bennett knew where my safe was. He knew the combination. He had known it since he was 18, when I had given it to him in case something happened to me. Howard suggested gently that I consider updating my arrangements. He did not push. He simply told me that in his 30 years of practice, the families that came apart over money almost never came apart suddenly, and that the people who got hurt the worst were usually the ones who waited too long to notice the pattern. I drove home and changed the combination on the safe that afternoon. It was the first small lie I told my son, and it would not be the last. Spring came, and with it came a thaw in Bennett's behavior that I did not entirely trust. He called on a Sunday afternoon with the warmth in his voice I remembered from before. He apologized for being distant. He said work had been overwhelming, that Sloan had been struggling with some private things, that they wanted me to come down for Easter, that Ren had been asking when Grandma was coming. He said the word grandma the way a man says a password he has been told will open a door. I drove down on a Saturday with a small ham and a tin of cookies and a wrapped book for Ren about a girl who tames horses. Ren was 6 by then. She opened the door before I rang the bell and wrapped her arms around my waist with the kind of force that small children use when they have been told their grandmother might not be coming back. I held her longer than I usually did. I did not say anything about it. Neither did she. Dinner was pleasant in the way performances are pleasant. Bennett asked about the workshop. Sloane refilled my water glass twice. Wren chattered about a school project involving a papier-mâché volcano. I watched all of them and tried to convince myself that the address change had been a clerical error, that I had been suspicious for no good reason, that families recover from misunderstandings all the time. After dinner, Bennett asked if he could borrow my reading glasses to look at something on his phone. I keep them in my purse. I told him to go ahead. He went into the living room with my purse and stayed there for nearly 4 minutes. I noticed because I counted. I had begun counting things by then. It is the kind of habit you do not realize you have developed until you are using it without thinking. I drove home the next morning. When I got back to Eugene and emptied my purse onto the kitchen table, I found that my checkbook was in a different pocket than the one I had put it in. The order of the cards in my wallet had been changed. Nothing was missing. Nothing was disturbed enough to prove anything to anyone who had not been counting. I called Howard Pratt on Monday and asked him to pull every record he could find with my name attached to it. Bank accounts, credit inquiries, anything filed in any court in Oregon involving Helena Marsh in the last 12 months. The report took him 3 weeks to assemble. When it arrived, it was thicker than I expected. There had been 2 credit inquiries pulled on my name in the previous 9 months, both from financial institutions I had never contacted. There had been a quiet petition filed in Multnomah County by an attorney representing Bennett, requesting that the court consider appointing him as a conservator over my affairs on grounds of suspected diminished capacity. The petition had been withdrawn before any hearing was scheduled. No notice of it had ever been sent to me. Howard explained that withdrawn petitions sometimes leave no formal trace if the petitioner moves quickly enough. He had only found it because he knew which clerk to ask. A life insurance policy in my name had been opened the previous October by a broker in Portland. The beneficiary was Bennett. The policy was for $600,000. I had not signed any application. I had not undergone any medical exam. The signature on the paperwork was a careful imitation of mine that would have fooled anyone who had not stared at their own handwriting on 1,000 invoices over 20 years. I sat in Howard's office with the folder in my lap and understood, finally and completely, what my son had decided I was worth. The number was $600,000. The condition was that I be dead. There is a particular quality of silence that settles into a room when a person fully accepts what is being done to them. It is not the silence of shock. Shock is loud. This was the silence of a decision arriving without being asked for. I sat in Howard's office for a long time without speaking. Outside his window, an Oregon spring rain had started, and the sound of it on the glass was the only sound in the room. Howard did not rush me. He had seen this expression on the faces of clients before, I think. He let me have the time I needed. When I spoke, I asked him a question I had not known I was going to ask. I asked him what would happen if a woman in my position simply went away. Not to another city, not to another state. Away. Howard set down his pen. He told me that what I was describing was technically not illegal in the way most people assumed, provided no fraud was committed against the government and no taxes were evaded and no public benefits were claimed under false pretenses. He told me that people did it more often than the public realized, usually women who had run out of other options. He told me he was not going to advise me to do it. He was also not going to advise me against it. He asked me one question in return. He asked me whether I had thought about what it would do to my granddaughter. I had thought about almost nothing else in the previous 3 weeks. I told him that Wren was 6 years old and that Sloane and Bennett had already begun the work of making me into an inconvenience she would learn to live without. I told him that if I stayed and fought through the courts, Bennett would file again and again until he found a judge or a doctor or a circumstance that worked in his favor, and that even if I won every battle, I would lose my granddaughter to a version of the truth that her parents controlled. I told him that if I went away, at least the version of me that survived in Wren's memory would be intact. A grandmother she had loved, not a grandmother she had watched her parents fight in a courtroom over money. I said all of that in one long breath. When I was finished, I was crying without realizing it. Howard handed me a tissue and said he would help me with what came next. The planning took 4 months. I sold the workshop quietly through an intermediary to a younger refinisher who had been wanting to expand. I liquidated the inventory through 3 different dealers in 3 different cities, taking smaller amounts than I could have gotten so as not to attract attention. I transferred what I could into a trust Howard had set up under a different name. The savings account I had opened for Wren when she was 5, I sealed and left alone. It would sit untouched for 22 years, accruing interest, waiting for a moment I could not yet see clearly but trusted would come. The disappearance itself was set for a weekend in late September. I drove to a small town on the Oregon coast called Manzanita and rented a cabin under my own name. I bought groceries at the local store. I made small talk with the owner of the cabin. I established in every visible way that Helena Marsh had been there. On Saturday morning, I drove my car to a beach access road known for its dangerous tides and unstable cliffs. I parked it. I left my purse on the passenger seat. I left a thermos of coffee, still warm, in the cup holder. Then I walked half a mile inland to a car Howard had arranged, and I drove east into a life that did not yet have a name. The news traveled the way I had expected it to travel. Search and rescue worked the coastline for 3 days. The car was found exactly where I had left it. A pair of my shoes, which I had carefully placed at the edge of the cliff, were photographed by a local reporter for the front page of a small newspaper. The tides that week were severe enough that no body was expected to be recovered, and none was. The Coast Guard officially closed the file 90 days later. Bennett collected on the life insurance policy in February. The $600,000 cleared into an account I had no way of tracking. Sloan organized a memorial service the same month. I was told later by Howard, who attended in the back row, that Wren wore a black dress with white tights and stood beside the empty casket holding a folded picture she had drawn of me in her kindergarten class. She did not cry during the service. She cried in the parking lot afterward when she thought her parents could not see her, holding the drawing against her chest with both hands. I have not asked Howard to describe that scene to me a second time. Once was enough. It is the closest I have ever come to walking back into my old life and undoing every decision I had made. The town I moved to first was a small place in northern Idaho called Sandpoint. I lived there under a different name for 6 years. I rented a 1-bedroom apartment above a hardware store and took a job at a furniture restoration shop owned by a quiet widower named Owen Hatch, who never asked me where I had come from. I worked for him for 4 of those 6 years before he passed away, and he left me the shop in his will, which surprised me considerably and changed the shape of what came next. I sold the Sandpoint shop after a year of running it and moved to a town outside Spokane and opened a new one under a corporate name that traced back through 3 layers of legal protection Howard had constructed for me. I had learned by then that I could not stop working. Working was the only thing that kept the silence in my head from becoming unbearable. The business grew faster than the one I had left in Eugene. I had become a different kind of operator by then, more careful, more patient, less attached to the outcome. By the time Wren turned 12, I had moved twice more and was running 3 small storefronts under 3 different ownership structures across Washington and Oregon. None of them carried my name. None of them ever would. I drove to Portland for the first time the spring Wren was 9. I had not been back in 3 years. I parked a rental car across the street from her elementary school 30 minutes before dismissal. When she came out the front doors with her backpack, I had to put both hands on the steering wheel to keep myself from opening the car door. She was taller than I had imagined. She had cut her hair short. She walked the way I had walked at her age, with her chin tilted slightly forward, as if the rest of her body was always trying to catch up with her thoughts. I sat in that car for 40 minutes after she had gone, because my hands would not stop shaking enough to drive. I went back the next year, and the year after that, I never approached her, I never sent anything. I never wrote a letter she would not be able to answer. I simply watched, the way a person watches a candle they have decided not to blow out, no matter how badly the wind blows, no matter how long the night becomes. The years arranged themselves into a rhythm I had not planned for but came to depend on. I worked. I moved every few years when the business outgrew its space, or when I felt the edges of my anonymity starting to soften. By the time Wren turned 15, I had moved to a small property outside Astoria, the one I still live in now, and I had built something I had never imagined building. The restoration business had become 3 businesses, and the 3 businesses had become a small holding company, and the holding company had begun acquiring estate properties at auction across the Pacific Northwest, restoring them, and reselling them at margins I had not believed possible when I was sanding chairs by hand in a garage in Eugene. By Wren's 18th birthday, the trust Howard managed on my behalf had crossed 7 figures. By her 21st, it had crossed 2. I did not feel rich. Wealth, when it arrives in the absence of the people you would have wanted to share it with, has a texture closer to weight than reward. I treated the money the way a careful gardener treats a stand of trees. I tended it. I did not measure it. I did not expect it to comfort me. I drove to Portland the morning of Wren's high school graduation. She was 18 by then and had been accepted to a university in Eugene of all places, the city I had run a refinishing shop in 3 decades earlier. I sat in the parking lot of her high school with a pair of binoculars I had bought specifically for the occasion. She walked across the stage in a navy gown. She had grown her hair out again. When her name was called, she lifted both arms above her head and laughed in a way that I recognized at a depth I cannot describe, because the laugh belonged to my own mother, who had died long before Wren was born, and who could not possibly have transmitted anything across 2 generations she had never lived to see. I cried in that parking lot until I had to take my glasses off to see the road home. There were close calls. There were always close calls. One year at a restoration trade show in Seattle, a buyer approached me at the booth and asked if I had ever lived in Eugene. He said my face reminded him of a woman he had bought a dresser from in 1996. I told him I had grown up in Montana and that strangers told me I had a familiar face all the time. He laughed and moved on. I sat down behind the booth and did not stand again for an hour. Another time, in a grocery store in Salem, I turned a corner with my cart and nearly collided with Sloan. She was 15 years older than the woman I had last seen on a porch in Portland. Her hair was different. She had become thinner in the face. She looked directly at me and did not recognize me at all. I had been gray for a decade by then. I had let the gray come in without coloring it for exactly this reason. I murmured an apology and pushed my cart past her. I drove home to Astoria that night with my hands at 10 and 2 on the wheel the entire way. I learned through quiet inquiries that Bennett and Sloan had separated when Wren was 14, that Sloan had moved to Salem, and that Wren had stayed with Bennett. I learned that the $600,000 had been spent within 4 years on a business venture that had failed, a series of vehicles, and a second mortgage on the Lake Oswego house, which they had eventually sold at a loss. Bennett had been working in commercial real estate ever since, never quite recovering the ground he had assumed his mother's death would give him. The decision arrived the way most important decisions had arrived in my life, without announcement, on an ordinary afternoon when I had been doing something else entirely. I was sitting on the porch in early September, sorting receipts from a furniture acquisition I had made in Walla Walla the previous week, when an email came through on a phone that only Howard and 2 of my employees had the number for. It was Howard. He had been keeping a quiet eye on Wren's public footprint for me for years. The email was 3 lines long. It said that Wren had registered a small business in Eugene under her own name, that she had signed a lease on a storefront on a side street I knew well, and that the business she had registered was a furniture restoration and estate sales operation. I read the email twice. Then I set the phone down on the porch railing and looked out at the fir trees and felt something I had not felt in 22 years, which was the particular sensation of a closed door becoming, without my permission, a door that wanted to be opened. She had not known. She could not have known. Bennett had told her, when she was a child, that her grandmother had been a woman who worked with her hands and had died in a swimming accident and had left behind almost nothing. Wren had grown up inside that version of me and had still, somehow without any guidance or inheritance, walked into the same trade I had walked into 50 years earlier. She had chosen it on her own. She was going to do what I had done in the same city where I had done it, and she was going to do it without knowing that her grandmother was still alive and had spent 2 decades building the exact resources she would need. I called Howard the next morning. I told him I wanted to begin the process of coming back. Howard had been waiting for that call for longer than I had realized. He had prepared most of the framework already. He explained that the legal situation was uncomplicated because no fraud had been committed against the government and no benefits had been claimed in my absence. I had simply been a missing person whose case had been closed. Reappearing required filing some paperwork and accepting that the life insurance payout to Bennett would be a matter for the insurance company to pursue, not me. I did not particularly care what the insurance company did with Bennett at that point. That was a problem he had built for himself a long time ago. What I cared about was the order of operations. I did not want to walk up to Wren's door. I did not want to arrive at her storefront in Eugene and watch her face try to assemble the impossible from the woman standing in front of her. Whatever she felt when she learned the truth, she deserved to feel it on her own terms, in her own space, without my presence shaping her reaction in real time. So I wrote the letters instead. I wrote 14 of them across 3 weeks, sitting at the kitchen table with the same fountain pen I had used to sign invoices in Eugene before Wren was born. The first letter was dated for the year she turned 7, the year of the empty casket. It was the letter explaining, in language a 7-year-old could not have understood at the time, but a 29-year-old could understand now, why her grandmother had gone away. The other 13 letters were dated for each year I had missed. Birthdays. Graduations. The day she had picked her major. The day she had signed the lease on her shop. Each one was true. Each one was specific. Each one had been written in my mind on the day it was dated. I had only now committed them to paper. Howard drove to Eugene on a Tuesday morning in late October. He went alone. We had agreed that the delivery would be made at Wren's shop mid-morning, before any customers were likely to be there, and that he would identify himself as an attorney representing her grandmother and would say nothing further until she had read the first letter. I stayed at the kitchen table in Astoria with my phone face down on the wood. I had told Howard not to call me until it was over. I made coffee I did not drink. I rearranged the spice rack twice. The fir trees outside the window did what fir trees do, which is to say nothing at all for hours at a time. Howard called at 4:17 in the afternoon. He told me in the careful way he had told me everything for 22 years that the delivery had gone the way we had planned it. Wren had been alone in the shop when he arrived. She had been refinishing a sideboard near the back when he came through the door. He had introduced himself. He had presented the envelope. He had asked her to open it in her own time and to read the first letter before deciding whether to read the others. She had opened it standing up. She had read the first letter twice. Then she had sat down on the floor of her shop in the middle of the workday, with sawdust in her hair, and read every letter in the envelope without speaking. Howard had stayed near the door because she had not asked him to leave. When she finished the last letter, she looked up at him with an expression he was not going to try to describe to me over the phone. She asked him one question. She asked him if I was still alive. Howard told her I was. He told her where I lived. He told her that she could come to Astoria whenever she was ready, and that I would not leave the house for any reason until she did. She did not come that night. She did not come the next day either. What she did instead was drive to her father's office in Beaverton on Wednesday afternoon with the envelope of letters in her hand. I learned the details of that meeting later, from Wren herself, in a conversation that took us nearly 6 hours and which I will not recount here in full, because some conversations belong to the people who had them. But the part that matters is this. She walked into Bennett's office without an appointment. She set the envelope on his desk. She asked him to read the first letter. He read 3 sentences before he stopped. She told me later that his hands had begun to shake before his face had time to register what was happening. He set the page down. He looked up at her. He tried to speak and could not. He stood up from his chair and then sat back down because his legs would not hold him. The color drained from his face the way water drains from a glass when you tip it slowly, evenly, all at once. She said she had read about that expression in books for most of her life and had never understood what it meant until she watched it happen to her father in real time. He asked her where the letters had come from. She told him. He asked her if I was alive. She told him. He did not ask any further questions. He sat in his chair and did not move and did not speak, and after a while Wren picked up the envelope and walked out of his office and drove 4 hours to my house in Astoria without stopping. She arrived at my front door at 11:40 that night. I opened the door before she knocked. We stood in the doorway for a long time without moving. She was 29 years old. She was taller than I had let myself imagine. She had her father's height and my mother's eyes, and she was holding the envelope of letters against her chest with both hands the way she had held the folded drawing at the empty casket when she was 7. She did not cry at first. She studied my face the way a restorer studies a piece they are trying to decide whether to save. Then she set the envelope down on the porch railing and walked into the house ahead of me, and I closed the door behind her and we sat at the kitchen table where I had written every letter and we talked until the sun came up over the fir trees. She did not forgive me that night. She did not need to. Forgiveness, when it is real, is not granted at a kitchen table at 3 in the morning. It is built slowly over years, the way I had built everything else. What we did instead was begin. Bennett called my house 6 times in the week that followed. I did not answer. I had no interest in punishing him, and I had no interest in accepting calls from him either. Whatever he had to say to me, he had owed me 22 years earlier, and the moment for it had passed. He eventually wrote a letter. It was 3 pages long. I read the first page and put the rest in a drawer I have not opened since. Wren tells me he is in therapy now. She tells me he has stopped asking her for money. I take her word for it. I do not need to know more. The trust Howard had managed for me was transferred into Wren's name 3 months after that night at the kitchen table. The money funded the expansion of her shop into the full storefront next door, and then into a warehouse on the south side of Eugene, and then into a second location in Bend. She runs the company the way I ran mine in the early years, with her hands in the work, with her eye on the wood. She is better at it than I was. I told her so the first time I visited her shop in person, and she laughed at me, and I understood that the laugh had finally arrived in a room where I was allowed to hear it. The savings account I had opened for her the year she was 5 had grown over 22 years into something neither of us had calculated until Howard put the figure on a piece of paper. It paid off the mortgage on her first house. There was enough left over for a second house she did not want and a third investment she did. I let her make those decisions without offering my opinion. She has not asked for it. She does not need it. I bought nothing for myself. I have what I need. The porch, the fir trees, the kitchen window that faces east, the small ceramic mug Wren made for me in a pottery class she took the summer after we met again, which sits on the sill where the morning light arrives first. It is lopsided. The glaze pulled heavily on one side. By any standard a serious restorer would apply, it does not qualify as finished work. It is the most valuable object I own. I sit on the porch most mornings now and I think about the years I spent watching from parked cars, and the years I spent building something I did not yet know who I was building for, and the way love, when it is real, does not require an audience or a reward or even a reunion to keep doing its work. It simply waits. It builds, and when the time comes, it knocks.